Thanks for joining us again on our knowledge series for Atlassian migrations. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at how to prepare and plan for a migration. So as always, we'll join our conversation with the team, and I think you'll pick up a lot of useful information. So let's jump into that now. Cheers. All right, so this next topic is around preparation for the migration. And so, Systemology, we've got our methodology for migration projects, and an important part of that is app assessment. So it's the assessment of migration, then we do planning and test migration, the production migration, etc. So there's a lot of detail work that goes through in executing a migration. Now, that can be expensive, and particularly when issues arise, everything slows down and we spend effort in resolving those issues. Now, this conversation is around what can a client do before we come into the project for migration, what can the client do ahead of that, do work to address these common issues that we come across so that they can remediate them before we do the project, and then the client's not spending money on us fixing those data issues. They've been done in advance by the client. So it's a way for the client to reduce the cost of the migration project and to spend some time doing some cleanup work ahead. So if we want to share with clients what are those things that we want them now to have a think about, let's talk about those items. And I suppose, the first one that for me that comes to mind is apps. So the migration of apps. Maybe Cale, if you can take us through, what's that whole issue around apps, and then what can a customer do ahead of time?
Sure. Yes, one of the biggest concerns generally for customers is, will my apps be available when I migrate to cloud? We use this app, we rely heavily on it. Will it be available to us? And Atlassian provides many pathways for performing migrations, but when it comes to apps, in some cases, the vendor has to be involved. My application migration strategies are available, and Atlassian is enhancing their migration tooling to include more apps within it, or at least a simplified migration strategy. But in many cases, approaching the vendor and identifying a migration pathway from server to cloud is essential. And that is something the client can do up front. It's not necessarily needed to be performed by a consultant or partner. And I would suggest that, something we would provide to our customers would be references to Atlassian documentation for the migration preparation pieces. So there are checklists that a customer can run through, ensure that they've got data in the right formats, the correct naming strategies, and it would also reference complications such as the app migration strategies.
Okay, that's good. And in fact, I suppose apart from that is the question of, which apps are important. I mean, Josh, you were working on a project where the client had to make a decision around apps.
Yeah, look, on this particular project, this client decided, we don't have any mission critical apps. And so when we migrate, we won't bring across any apps at all. And that saved them a lot of grief and a lot of effort on the project as well. So that was an option that worked really well for them.
Yeah, good one. Okay. All right, so then apart from apps, and so the message there is a client can spend the time ahead of the project to review which apps are important, decide which ones they want to focus on within the migration project, and then in fact even have a look at some of the information around the migration of those apps, because there may well be some scope that they can take on to either prep for the migration of those apps or, take some of that scope. So moving on from apps, then the other kind of real common issue that we come across in migrations is data issues, data conflicts, data gaps. And in fact, I know, Josh, in some of your work, there were issues with user accounts. I mean, what's that all about?
Yeah, this is a very typical case that comes up in migrations to cloud. So whenever we're migrating users, Atlassian looks at the email as the key identifier for users. And so if you have any accounts that have no email address, that presents an issue. Secondly, any user that shares an email address with another user, that's equally an issue. So, you know, if customers can address those issues prior to the migration, that will save a lot of time.
Yeah. And anything about kind of the username or anything else around the user?
No, the key field is the email address. So if that email address is resolved, then the migration can move along smoothly.
Okay, great. And then, Cale, any other sort of data points that are problematic, common targets?
Yes, Atlassian does provide a list of known environmental limitations from a server environment to cloud that would present issues during a migration and mitigation strategies for it, such as conflicting duplicate key names for projects or slugs in Bitbucket, whether it's case sensitivity is a fact on cloud. So having two workflows in Jira with the same name, even though the case is different, that presents itself a conflict during the migration. So there are myriad steps to follow to ensure your data is in the respective format that the cloud expects and to guarantee or hopefully guarantee the successful migration.
And do you think that they're all elements that a client could address, have the skills to address any kind of special skills required to clean that data up?
I think that it's a mixture. So there is definitely a Jira administrator level user will be able to resolve certain complications, but there is certainly things that would require a more advanced database access and potentially even application server access.
Okay. And then what else? I mean, we've got, so there's those pieces of data that the client can go and address. Anything else to add here on this topic? I mean, what about, we've got, one of the things that I've noticed over the last kind of 6-12 months is, we use the Atlassian Migration Assistant. And, when that came out 12 months ago, it didn't do much. And, fortunately for everyone, it does a lot more now. But it's something that keeps improving over time. Is there anything worth mentioning about that app?
Sorry. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that the app has come a long way. We do come across limitations in some of our projects, and we call that out when we see them.
Then I suppose the final point to make on this topic is the migration assistant that we've been using, either the Jira migration assistant, the Confluence migration, Bitbucket migration assistant, all these Atlassian apps that are used to support migration, they continue to be developed. So 12 months ago, you couldn't do much with them. There was a lot of manual lifting for migration, which had big implications for the client, made projects bigger and more complex. Now, as that app is, more feature rich and does more, it makes the project easier. It gives, less prep work to do. But I suppose the point to make is that, those apps are still not perfect, 100%. Click, next, migration done. So there's still a lot of complex work to be done. And over time, as the apps continue to be developed, what can and can't be done will continue to change. So I suppose the message for customers is, when you're thinking about this, thinking about moving to the cloud, talking to a partner like Systemology around what is the work that you can do, what can the migration apps take care of? We'll give you a current view of that, and your planning can take that into account. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to the topic of how long does a migration take? So this is the question that every client has when they're trying to plan, budget and just get their head around what's it going to take to go to cloud. Clients want to know how long will it take. So let's talk about a couple of examples, because really this definition of how long it takes is a really complex one to answer. So maybe Josh, we'll throw to you for your first example.
Yeah, sure. So I was working with a client who wanted to move just a few projects to cloud from server. And this migration the migration segment itself took about a month. Now, granted, back then, the migration app was a lot less feature rich than it is today, particularly in regards to JSM projects. So there were a lot of challenges that we had there. But really what I found and what I took away from that experience was that challenges arise even with those simple projects. So yeah, it was about a month or so of time.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And Carl, you worked on a more complex migration. Give us the overview of that one.
Certainly. I worked on one client's migration, the server-to-server migration in particular, which was incredibly complex and with a very large data set. And the complexity tied into the overall duration. We knew and we expected it to be a longer period, a couple of months minimum. But during the process, of course, given the complexity, issues do arise and time frame can be pushed out. So it really is difficult to gauge that. And one of the difficulties we definitely have is managing the expectation of how long a project's going to take. So when gauging at the beginning, it's important to know what you're working with and to try and identify all of the different aspects of the project and the complexity you're going to face, but knowing that you need some overhead.
And so what was the overall time frame for that project?
It was up to the 6 month end.
Yeah.
It was a much longer project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that so that's a really there's some really useful bookends for time frame, right? So a month, 6 months, as we see, there's complexity has an impact, but equally, both of those examples had problems, so there are, regardless, best laid plans, there'll always be issues that we come across that need to be addressed. And so that's part of the challenge of trying to get a clear view of the timeline for a migration. And, that's also points to the importance of doing that assessment phase. Our methodology around doing our migration starts with an assessment phase. That could be as little as a week of effort, could be maybe 2 weeks or more of effort, depending on the environment. And that assessment is about us looking at and understanding what the client environment is, and then being able to get a much more accurate view of what that timeline may well be. So, it's critical for clients really to first have that assessment done before we lock down any expectations around the timeline of the project. And Carl, you mentioned a good point around managing expectations. So we've found that it's really important, certainly when we're working with the client team, we're really working hard to have shared expectations around, what's being done and the timeline that we're working to. But equally, within the client organization, it's really critical for the client team to manage expectations within their organization, with their stakeholders. Because quite often, look, the rest of the business is really keen to just get to the cloud and get working. And so, we often see pressure coming from the business into the project team, from the client just wanting to get there. So again, this stuff is about working through in a really focused way and not cutting any corners. So yeah, so insofar as answering that question is how long is that piece of string, we've got those examples. And I think most customers would fit, within those two periods. But again, the key is in getting that assessment done. So, all right, that's probably enough on that topic. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you found that useful. Now, if you want to chat to us about your migration, just reach out to us using the contact forms here on the website, and we'll have a chat to you. So apart from that, we've got our final episode coming up shortly. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you there. Cheers.